Hi, my name is Chantal Comeau and I'm an English teacher at École Mathieu-Martin. And today's pedagogical capsule is the literary element that we know as conflict. So essentially this is what is the problem in the story? It can be a poem, a movie, a short story, a book, but there's got to be some kind of tension. So it's either the traditional easygoing story where we refer to tension. So there's got to be some kind of questioning involved, some kind of wondering or problem. Oftentimes the problem can be more intense, in which case it might be a little easier to determine what the conflict is. So the step-by-step process, the first thing that you do is you choose a category. In grades 9 and 10, we have narrowed it down to 3. There are 3 very common ones. 2 are the most popular. The first one is person versus person. So this is your traditional 2 groups of people, or good versus evil, or 2 people fighting in the story. It can be with words or even physically with a slap or a kick, depending on the story in question. This is considered external, so it's outside of the person. And we see this in the behavior and the choices of the character in the storyline. Another kind of conflict is person versus self. So versus himself or herself, depending. So this is inside the person. This is where you see the character at the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story that they're angry, they're feeling guilty, they're feeling confused. So in here and in here is the internal conflict. The last one is person versus nature. This is really Mother Earth. So tornadoes, mudslides, hurricanes, tsunamis versus the cold, versus the heat, being abandoned in the desert, for example. Survival stories often are considered versus nature. It can also be animals, so attack of the bees, attack of the spiders, attack of the locusts, the birds, etc. So this would all be considered Mother Nature. After you've chosen the category, from there you have to specify the names, because sometimes in stories some of the names can be similar or it's unclear to whom the student is referring. So if it's Bob versus Trina, then you have 2 people. If you've got Alex versus himself, or if it's a girl, Alex versus herself, then you specify the gender if it's an internal conflict. And if it's versus nature, you would say it can be a group of people, so Dieppe versus the ants, let's say. So you have to specify exactly who you're referring to. If there are 18 characters in the story and you say it's the main character versus himself, there could also be 7 main characters of those 14, like in the book The Outsiders, for example. You have to specify exactly who you're referring to so that you get all your points and that it's crystal clear. From there, this is the biggest chunk, this is the biggest part of the development answer, is to explain and give proof like you do in all of your classes. The best way to approach this for the story is to treat it as at the beginning of the story we see, you explain and give proof. At the middle of the story we see, or later it continues, then again in chapter 11, then again in chapter 20. At the end of the book, finally the conflict is resolved, or not resolved, and you explain and you give an example. This is the longest part. Depending on what level you're at, it can be anywhere from 2 lines to 35 lines. It's also considered kind of a summary, a résumé de l'histoire, in a very guided, specific form. Here are several questions that we usually get. Can a person versus person, can this be groups of people? So the answer is yes. So for the book The Outsiders, for example, it can be the Socs versus the Greasers. If you're reading Night, it can be the prisoners versus the Nazis. Person versus self, can it be an illness or a disease? Is that where we put that kind of story? Does it go into that category? And the answer is yes. So if the main character of your story is dealing with cancer, a bone disease, becoming blind, anything along that nature, it would go into this category, assuming that it is also accompanied by feelings of guilt, confusion, wondering, unsure, or uncertainty, then it would all fit into that category. Then you would prove it from the beginning and the middle and the end of the story. Person versus nature, I often get this question. Well, what if the main character is versus a bear? So he had an enormous will to live, for example. The animal is not talking, it is not thinking, it is not a character, okay? So if it doesn't speak, so if it's not a cartoon, then in that case, it is considered nature. If, for example, you've read the book Animal Farm, where there are animals on a farm and they take on character traits and they speak and they have an intellect, then in that case they become characters and it would be explained under this category. But if they're considered animals raw, brute animals in nature and they don't speak and they don't have intellectual capacities as humans do, then it would go into this category, person versus nature. So bees, bears, fish, etc. Can there be more than one conflict? Absolutely. Most storylines have 4 or 5 sub-conflicts or sub-stories. So oftentimes we'll ask you to choose the best one or the main one. Which one is the longest, happens the most intensely from the beginning to the end of the book, then that would be the best answer. And of course, you explain and give proof, and you get the points accordingly. So if you were to write out an answer, this is how it would take form, a development answer. It would look something like this, following the 3 chunks. The main conflict of the story blank is person versus blank, so you choose the category. From there, you would continue to explain. Many times during the story, we see that blank is working against blank. So you would say Bob is working against Trina, Alex is versus himself. You give the names. Then the last part is the biggest chunk of the question. At the beginning of the story, we see that Alex and Kim are fighting. Alex steals Kim's dog, shaves it down, and leaves it on the porch. This shows that they are in conflict. Then later in the story, in chapter 4, this person returns the conflict. So if you're talking about person versus person, then that's the form that it would take. If you're working with a short story, you can do a page instead of a chapter, or a line if it's a poem. We see again later in chapter 11, as well in chapter blank, and then you're working towards the end of the story. Finally, at the end, near chapter or near paragraph, depending, the conflict is finally resolved when, assuming that the conflict is resolved. And if it isn't, you explain that it is unresolved, and you give an example anyway, and that finishes off your answer. So, to recap and to review everything, conflict is a problem or tension in the story. You choose a category. We focus on 3 main ones in grade 9 and 10. The rest that are more complex and more abstract, we develop in grades 11 and 12. Give the names, explain, give proof, and cover from the beginning, the middle, and the end of the story. And that concludes today's pedagogical capsule, conflict, which is the literary element that means a problem or tension in a story. Thank you.